I'm just blessed to get into this Torah portion with you guys this week. This week's Torah portion is actually a double portion. It's Vayakhel and Pekudei. Vayakhel means he gathered, and Pekudei means countings. And this week's portion, both of them, goes from Exodus 35:1 to Exodus 40:38. And this is actually the last Torah portion in the book of Exodus. Next week, we'll be starting everyone's favorite book, the book of Leviticus. We're going to be learning all about the nitty-gritty details concerning sacrifices and ritual purity and all of that stuff. And Leviticus actually is a favorite of mine. So I'm personally excited to dig into that book again. But today, we're still in Exodus, and we're still learning all about the construction of the tabernacle. That's what we've been kind of going over the last few Torah portions, is the construction of the tabernacle. So, to give a quick summary, Exodus 35 to 38, it tells of how the Israelites built the tabernacle. And then chapters 39 through 40 talks a little bit more about that. It also gives some records or countings of all the materials that were gathered and how exactly they were used for completing the tabernacle. And then at the very end of the book of Exodus, Moses describes something amazing. This is what it says in Exodus 40, starting in verse 34. It says, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." Okay, so the glory of the Lord filled this tent in the wilderness. The glory of the Lord filled this tent in the wilderness. And this is actually what I want to talk about a little bit today, because this is really the climax of the book of Exodus. The climax of the story, believe it or not, was not Israel's deliverance from slavery in Egypt. As amazing as that was not the climax of the book of Exodus. The climax is that God came down to dwell with man. That's really the conclusion, the climax of this amazing story of Exodus. That was the point of the Exodus. God dwelling with man, man having fellowship with God. It was a restoration of Eden, if you will, at least a partial restoration. In fact, the tabernacle was sort of a microcosm of the Garden of Eden. You have all of the symbolism, the menorah representing the tree of life, and all of these types of things that symbolized the Garden of Eden within the tabernacle itself. So it's a recreation of the garden. And in the book of Revelation, we actually see the same ending. At the very end of the age, there's a new heaven and a new earth. A new Jerusalem comes down from heaven, and then it says, "Finally, behold, God dwells with man. He shall be their God, and they will be his people." So that is how the book of Revelation ends, is the same story. Just like at the end of the book of Exodus, God dwells with man in fullness. And that is the greatest desire of God's heart. Did you know that? That's why he created us, because he wants to dwell with us. He wants to have that relationship with you. Think about that for a minute. The sovereign God of the universe wants to hang out with you. I often think about Psalm 8. I know that Pastor Matthew, he's going to be speaking on the Psalms later today, and I'm really excited to hear his sermon. But in Psalm 8, I often think about this. David is describing the utter majesty and the beauty of creation. And then he asks a question after observing and describing all of this beauty around him. He says, "What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him?" Who are we that the God of the universe cares about us? And he not only cares about us, but also he wants a relationship with us. That's the point of your life. That's the point of your existence, to know God, to grow in your relationship with him, to bring glory to his name. And by the way, that is what you need more than anything. What God wants most, which is this relationship with you, is what you need most. You need God's presence in your life more than anything. He's the true source of fulfillment and joy in this life. Now, with that said, I think this Torah portion teaches us a valuable principle concerning our role in this relationship with God, because we have a role in this relationship. What we see in this Torah portion is that God inspired regular humans to build him a house. God sanctified the work of human hands, and he took up residence in a literal tent in the wilderness that somehow overlapped with the heavenly realm. Through human effort, God's divine presence inhabited a temporal space in the wilderness. So think about that for a moment. Humans, regular, dusty Israelites, worked to create a sacred space for God, and God saw fit to dwell in this tent that these regular Israelites made. So there are a couple of observations that I think we can make from this. Number one, we as humans, we have the capacity to create a sacred space for God within our temporal realm. And number two, God is pleased to dwell in that space that we create for him. Number one, we as humans, we have the capacity to create a sacred space for God within our temporal realm. And number two, God is pleased to dwell in that space that we create for him. This is especially true, I think, in light of the new covenant that has been inaugurated in the Messiah Yeshua. In Ephesians chapter 2, Paul says that believers, both Jews and Gentiles, we are, quote, being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 2, he says that we are like living stones, quote, being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood. And we, quote, offer spiritual sacrifices that are acceptable to God through Messiah Yeshua. So we have the capacity right now, even though there's no physical tabernacle or temple in Jerusalem, we have the capacity right now in your own living room to build a sacred space for God in our lives. We have the capacity to offer up spiritual sacrifices to God that are acceptable to God through the Messiah, Yeshua, spiritual sacrifices of prayer, of praise, of worship, of acts of charity. Paul says that when we surrender our lives in service to the Messiah, that our lives serve as a living sacrifice. So this raises a question. A giant chunk of Exodus is dedicated to telling us all about the work that the Israelites did to build the tabernacle so that God would dwell among them. So here's the question. How much effort do you put into making room for God's presence to dwell in your life? How much effort do you put into making room for God's presence to dwell in your life? We already know that God is pleased to dwell among his people. He wants to dwell with you. He desires to have that communion with you. But I think that sometimes we often don't sense his presence in our lives. And that's not because of a lack of desire on God's part, but because of a lack of desire on our part. We haven't made room for God's presence. We haven't worked to create a sacred space for God in the midst of our busy schedules, in the midst of our earthly pursuits, in the midst of our anxiety and worries about the future, whatever the case may be. But perhaps now is a good time. During this shutdown of our country because of this virus going around, perhaps now is a good time to really try to pursue God and to make that space for Him in our lives, to carve out that sacred space for Him. We can take this opportunity to reprioritize our lives around what's most important. You need the presence of God in your life more than anything. You may think right now that you need something else more than anything. You might be desperate about this worry or that thing. But what you need more than anything right now is God's presence in your life. And that is what God wants. He wants to dwell with you. So I would encourage you to put forth the effort to really create that sacred space for God. I would encourage you to pursue His presence, to draw near to Him, and He will draw near to you, as James tells us. Make the time to pray, to sing, to worship, to study the Scriptures. Surrender your life as a living sacrifice. Seek out those that you can serve. That may just be your own family right now. Seek out ways that you can serve, that you can help, that you can be an example of Messiah Yeshua who came to serve. At the end of the age, God will make His permanent dwelling among us. His presence will fill the whole earth. Until then, we can still encounter His presence today. But just like Israel worked to construct the tabernacle, we need to do our part to create a sacred space for God in our lives so that His glory and His presence will dwell among us. Thank you, guys.